And we're live. What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless engineer. If you're obviously you're watching it on my channel, so y'all know who I am. But I'm sitting down today to talk with Cathryn Sterling, who is a Christian apologist that's somewhat local to me here in North Alabama. And we decided to sit down and kind of talk about whose worldview better explains, I guess, our world or our reality, or best explains things in general. So hi there, Cathryn. How are you doing? No, thank you for coming on. I always enjoy a good conversation with somebody that doesn't agree with me. So, yeah, I know. Because there's such a propensity out there right now to have such bad conversations online. I always jump at the chance to present a good conversation between people that don't agree on something. So, yeah, thank you so much for coming on. Do you want to tell everybody like where they can find you and kind of what you do and stuff?
And in North Alabama. So it is kind of neat to have this local conversation via the interwebs, right? So it is kind of. I've been an engineer for a long time, and now I homeschool my children and have a ministry. So I appreciate the chance to get to come on and chat with you, kind of about different worldview perspectives and just kind of understand each other a little bit better.
Yeah, so it's so great. Now, I'm terribly sorry about this, but one of the common things with live streams is technical difficulties, and they couldn't hear you. They couldn't hear you at first. So could you repeat like what your ministry name is and everything like that?
Yes, it's defendthefaithministry.com is my website, so they can go there, and they've got all the links there for Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and all that stuff. So they can find me there.
Yes, definitely. Okay. Yes, yeah, that's good. Audio is good now. I'm so sorry about that.
No, that's okay.
But so today we're going to be talking about which worldview explains things better or more clearly, or however you want to put it. And we decided beforehand that Cathryn was actually going to go first. So Cathryn, I will just go on ahead and give you the floor. Okay. So my audience is yours.
All right. Well, thank you. So I'm going to share a few charts just to kind of give some visuals as we go through this. So give me just a second as I get those pulled up. Okay, so yes, we decided to kind of discuss this idea of is there a God? And kind of more specifically, which worldview, whether the atheistic worldview where there is no God, or the theistic worldview where there is some sort of God, which one would best explain the existence that we have? So the cool thing, especially since John and I are both engineers, we kind of get in that world of ones and zeros, either ors, it's black or white. And that's the thing with God's existence. There either is a God or there's not a God. There's not anything in between. There's not a kind of sort of maybe halfway kind of God. So really the question is, how can we ever know whether there is or is not? And especially when God is not something that we can prove through that scientific method or some repeatable experimentation type of thing. We have to rely on other types of reasoning to really get to a conclusion that best explains the world that we see. And really it's kind of what we would use in a court of law to prove something, in that realm of beyond reasonable doubt. So we want to kind of refer to that as a presumption of fact. So this is where a fact is going to stand to be true based on a solid presumption based on how we know the world works. And it's going to stand to be true unless it can be refuted otherwise. So we can't go back and repeat the past and prove the past through this scientific method and repeatable experiment type thing. So even lawyers and jurors and judges, they have to rely on this type of evidentiary reasoning that's really considered this presumption of fact. What is going to be the best explanation to the facts that they're observing. Now, at the end of the 19th century, there's an American philosopher named Charles Sanders Peirce who coined the term abductive reasoning that really applied this to one of the many ways that we can define logic and reasoning. And it's almost like an inference to the best explanation. So in other words, what is the most plausible explanation to the events that are being observed based on how we know the world works? So we're using evidence, we're using the understanding of the limitations of nature and science to look at the observed world and determine what best explains that. So we're going to apply this to the same question of what is the most logical explanation to how the world got here that would explain why this world is here. Now, I am a former engineer at NASA. I did systems engineering there. Which, that's just that interdisciplinary field of engineering where you're looking at all the different aspects of the design to make sure it will work together. So specifically what I did was I was checking over the launch vehicle design of the Ares 1 upper stage. So this is quite a while back, but it was to verify all the subsystems on that upper stage were going to work together. So asking questions like, well, is the main propulsion system putting a fluid line right on top of an avionics box, or does the thrust vector control system need power and coding or something that the avionics system is not aware of? So making sure that there's communication, that all these things are going to hook up and connect and function together. But then I also looked at the shipping environment. So once we build this upper stage, we're going to have to ship it around to the Cape for it to be launched, and it's going to actually be in a different orientation. It's going to go through different environments. It's laying horizontal instead of vertical, like at the launch pad. So what needs to be covered? How are we going to lift it? How are we going to stack it? Where do we need access to prep things for launch? So all of these things are what, the systems engineers are looking at and going through to make sure that not just does it launch, but can we get it to the launch pad? Are all these systems going to work together? Now, I think everyone would agree that this clearly involves intelligence, that there is some sort of design effort, lots of design, lots of redesign, lots of communication about design in order for all of these things to come together and work. And that is your solid presumption of fact. Now, you didn't witness it being built or designed. You might not even know a specific person that works at NASA that had something to do with this design. But just because of all the integrated components that have to go in together, that if you remove any of them, it doesn't work. That somewhere there's intelligence behind the system in order to lay it out this way, in order to bring all those components together, to size them the right way, to integrate them, to co-locate them, to make sure they're not interfering with other things. So it's evident that from this launch vehicle, it's not just a random assembly of parts. The vehicle could not have assembled itself. It could not have designed itself. You can't just add one thing on top of each other, right? You couldn't start with the engine and then start adding a structure to it without going back and thinking of all the other systems at play. Because when you add a new component, it might interfere with the previous function that's necessary, or it might preclude the next function that you're stacking onto it. So it has to be an integrated effort in order for all these things to work together. Now, what in the world does this have to do about the existence of God? Well, if there's this same kind of systems engineering that's in biology or that's found in nature, then we're going to have that solid presumption of fact as well, that there has to be some sort of intelligence behind it, bringing these things together and coordinating them so that they'll function. And really in nature, the function is to not die, right? The function is to continue to live and be productive. And so that, again, is that solid presumption of fact. You didn't witness it. You might not have known anything that, how it came together, but that there is intelligence involved. There is design. There has to be a designer behind something that's clearly designed, that it can't be incrementally built up from something simple. So when we kind of step back and we take a look, and there's lots of different examples that we can go to, but I think especially kind of making this connection to this launch vehicle, I think it's neat to look at the human body organ systems. So there's 11 different organ systems that all function together to keep the body alive. And then, so each one is performing a specific function, but they're all interdependent. And so I'm going to take just a kind of a deep dive into one of these particular systems just to show this kind of interdependency across just the human body. So we're going to start with the circulatory system, which of course, the whole purpose of that is to pump blood all around the body. It includes the heart, the blood vessels, the veins, the arteries. And it's really to send that oxygen out to your cells so that they can go and do work. And then it brings the waste products from that work back to the heart to be expelled out. Now, if it's bringing oxygen, of course, it's relying on the respiratory system because, the circulatory system itself cannot get oxygen into the body, but the respiratory system does. And so its function is to bring in that oxygen. And of course, when the deoxygenated cells come back, it has to expel out the waste products of the water and carbon dioxide. So we have this interdependence between the respiratory system and the circulatory system, but both of these are dependent on the nervous system. If we didn't have the brain and the spinal cord and all of the system and network of nerves that go out to these organs and organ systems, then none of them will function. In fact, there's a specific section of the brain called the hypothalamus that's in charge of those autonomic functions, which are those functions that your body does without you having to think about it. You don't have to tell your lungs to breathe. It's doing it for you, but it's sending these signals and it's controlling this, where if we didn't have that brain, then the lungs would be useless. If we didn't have the lungs, then the heart would be useless. But then they're also dependent on the muscular system because the heart, after all, is a muscle. It's a very special type of muscle called the cardiomyocytes, where it can actually contract and pump this blood, which is different from how the other muscle cells in our body work. But it's dependent on the skeletal system because the blood that's being pumped around is actually formed from the bone marrow. And so it is producing the white and red blood cells and the platelets and the plasma and all of those things that your body needs to circulate through to do work. It's coming from the skeletal system. It's also dependent on the urinary system. It's the kidneys that filter the blood, return clean blood back into the bloodstream. And then you're even dependent on the endocrine system because there's different hormones that can monitor the blood sugar levels. It can even increase your heart rate when it senses that fight or flight mode. So it knows you're about to either fight or run away. And so you need your heart rate to go ahead and go up to prepare your body for that. So all of these things are now dependent on one another, where if you removed one of these systems, the whole thing stops working, right? You can't just have the body built up with, we'll start with just the circulatory system and then later we'll add the respiratory system, because none of these things work unless all of these things are here together. So it's really the epitome of this systems engineering design, where all of these systems have to not only have their individual components and be functional as their own system, but they're dependent on all the other systems in order to completely function. So that presumption of fact, the same type of thing that we would apply to that launch vehicle, applies here to the human body, that there's some sort of integration component, there's some sort of intelligence behind this to pull all these pieces together and assemble it so that it will survive, because it can't survive with any one of these things removed. Just like our launch vehicle, if all we started with was just the engine, but we didn't have the main propulsion system, then we couldn't function. It wouldn't get off the ground. You can't have one system and then later apply the next one. You need all of those components there together at the same time. And so you could almost apply the same terminology of our human body systems to the launch vehicle, that we have the engine and we have the circulatory system, which is our propulsion system, and you have the brain, which is your avionics, and you have the rec system, which is your kidneys. So all of these things, you could see a direct application to the systems engineering involved in this launch vehicle as what we see in the body. But it kind of goes a step further, because even if we design this vehicle, you need all of that communicated to someone to go build it. So here we need all the schematics, we need all of our CAD drawings and the blueprints and the diagrams and everything in order to go build this vehicle. And our bodies even have that too. So all living things are made up of cells, and cells are considered the basic building block of all life. And though we have two different types of cells, there's one thing in common across all different types of cells, whether it's from bacteria to mammals to reptiles to whatever. They all have to have DNA. And that DNA is actually described as the blueprint of all life. So just like we need those schematics in order to build a launch vehicle, or even when you've done those some assembly required projects at home, which I love, by the way, you're totally dependent on those instructions telling you how to assemble it. And if you don't have the right instructions, or if the instructions are hard to read, which granted they usually are, then you end up with a poorly built, non-functional system or furniture or whatever it is that you're building. And so our bodies are the same way. We need that DNA as the blueprint to go give those instructions so that your body can know, if it's manufacturing a human, it means, 2 eyes, 2 ears and 1 heart, and 1 stomach, which is going to be different for another type of organism. And those instructions are stored in our DNA. Now, the presumption of fact then is not just, hey, we have instructions that give guidance to our cells of what proteins to make, but where is that information coming from? When we look at the schematics of a launch vehicle or those, assembly instructions for a project at home, something intelligent behind that had to lay those out. They had to communicate that. And it's information. It's not just data. Data is different. The information is actually informing you what to go do and how to go do it. And that requires intelligence. And so if in our bodies we have what even secular textbooks would call the blueprint of life, there has to be intelligence behind that level of information that's guiding the body and telling it what to go do. But it really, our bodies take it a step further because it puts all of that information in code. And I love this quote by E.H. Andrews. He's a professor of materials at the University of London. He says, "It's not possible for a code of any kind to arise by chance or accident. A code is a work of an intelligent mind. Even the cleverest dog or chimpanzee could not work out a code of any kind. So it's obvious then that chance cannot do it. Codes do not arise from chaos." And so that's really, we've got not just information in these schematics and blueprints directing the manufacturing of your body. It's stored in a code. And so that requires a whole extra level of intelligence and an intelligent mind behind it. And that's because of how we know the world works. We know that information does not come out of nothingness. We know that code cannot come out of chaos. And so because of how this world works, that solid presumption of fact is that there has to be intelligence behind this. And we can even see that from this quote from Bill Gates, where he says, "Human DNA is like a computer program, but far, far more advanced than any software ever created." So if we could agree that a computer code cannot randomly generate and execute a simple program, then we have to look at the DNA that's guiding the proteins, the RNA, that is the basic building block of all life, is going to be that complex. It's going to be that level of information stored in a code that requires some sort of intelligence behind it. So really the most plausible explanation, because of how we know the world works, is that design and information organized into a code has to come from some sort of intelligent source. And so that's, to me, one of the amazing things about looking at this world, that it's not saying, well, in spite of the information or because we don't have information, we're going to insert God. It's because of how we know information comes from intelligence, that we know there's something intelligent that is putting this information into this universe and doing the systems engineering design of our bodies.
All right. Thank you so much for that presentation there. So I don't really have anything as formally written, so you're a bit more prepared than I am. But generally, when we're talking about this subject, what I like to point out is that the prior experiences and prior instances of us explaining things with an intelligent creator or God have generally been proven to not require God. And so that seems to be the prior probability, is that anything that occurs in reality seems to be natural, or at least eventually explained through natural processes. And with a lack of evidence to suggest that a God is required for nature to operate, I think that it would take a monumental amount of evidence in order to prove that a God is required for nature to operate. Now, I notice one of the big points of the presentation that you gave was the teleological argument, and I didn't exactly know which way you were going to go with your presentation, so I'm just kind of I'm kind of tailoring what I normally talk about, as I saw that you argued. But as far as the teleological argument goes, a lot of things in nature appear to be designed because our pattern-seeking brains recognize what we think is design in nature. And because of this fact, things seem designed to us. They seem to work as if somebody designed them, but it's actually natural processes that can explain why those things are there. Typically, I try to give this example just as a simple example, and that would be the water cycle. I don't see the need for God in the water cycle because everything happens naturally. There's a natural cause for water vapor to form, from liquid water. It heats up, it gains energy, and it transforms from liquid water to water vapor. It rises up into the air, and then once it's up in the air, it at some point it cools down and it forms back into liquid water, and then it rains. And this cycle repeats and it repeats and it repeats, and it's a lot more complicated than that. But just trying to simplify it and point it out how we don't need God to explain rain, but at one point in time in the past, we definitely needed God to explain rain, lightning, any number of natural weather events. We would explain with God. The eclipses were also explained with God. So I can understand the I guess focusing in on the teleological argument, but I find that the teleological argument is very weak because, like, going back to your example of the rocket system, we have background knowledge on the rocket system that shows there's no natural process that would cause a rocket system like that to form on its own. We don't have any reason to think that it just by chance like fell into place like that, which would be a natural process. We know for a fact that people designed it and everything. So it seems like, given the rocket, it's a reasonable conclusion to think that somebody designed it. Now, transferring that to the natural world, if we were to look at like any of the organisms or plants on this planet, we can see like development from simpler biological systems to more complex biological systems. This comes in the form of the fossil record, also with life that occurs here on Earth now. For instance, like with you didn't bring this up in your presentation, but like the development of the eye. The eye is a somewhat complex organ in our bodies, but it's also not perfect, and it's definitely not the best pair of eyes out there. I mean, you could think of like a hawk's eye that can see vast distances and stuff like that. You have in nature living examples of every stage of the development of the eye, from just collections of photosensitive cells to all the way up to the concave eyes that we have. And so it seems to me like if you take any one particular organism or like plant, animal, whatever, you can find natural reasons as to why those things developed the way that they did. Now, as far as like you were talking about the interdependency of all the systems in the human body, and of course, if you remove somebody's lungs and you don't replace them with like maybe artificial lungs, or like if you remove the heart or the circulatory system and don't replace those in some kind of fashion, obviously that breaks the system, right? Because the human bodies have evolved to operate with certain things in certain ways. And so if you disrupt that system, then the entire thing goes out of whack, and you end up with a broken, quote unquote, machine, if you will. I know that from personal experience because my pancreas is broke. I have diabetes. And so because my pancreas is broke, I have to supplement it with insulin. Otherwise, I would have died a long time ago. Obviously, if you take out any one system, then it's going to cause the human machine to crash. But that doesn't mean that all organisms or every stage of human evolution requires a lungs or a circulatory system or anything like that. There's actually one type of salamander that doesn't have lungs. It actually absorbs oxygen through its skin. And then there's spiders. They don't really have a circulatory system. It's just kind of a big mush in there. I'm not a biologist or a zoologist or anything like that, but I mean, there are spiders out there that don't have a circulatory system, so it doesn't really seem to me like those things are necessary for organisms, like in general. But to say that, if you take out one particular system from this one organism, it's going to break. So therefore, everything had to have been created at once or whatnot. I think kind of maybe it ignores the mountains of evidence that we have to show that these systems developed gradually over time. And I know that your position's creationism, or creation, or maybe intelligent design. I know sometimes those can be viewed differently, but I don't see is evidence that everything was created all at once. What I don't see is an actual intelligent designer behind it. Because if we just take the human body, for instance, why I feel like if somebody were to have system engineered the body, they would have not signed off on the human body, because you have so many different things that could go wrong and do go wrong on a regular basis. I mean, even if you go to your DNA example, with God creating DNA, or DNA being intelligently designed, I really don't think that any human engineer would look at how DNA operates and be like, this is good. I don't see, especially the perfect intelligent designer, like signing off on how that operates, just because of how we know DNA interacts with the different chemicals and how it interacts in general. I don't see why they would sign off on a system that has regular errors that happen in it. Typically, whenever you're engineering a system, you want to try to drive those risk factors down of like errors or problems. Shifting back to your rocket example, I don't think that most engineers presume that the rockets work just because engineers built it. I think that they did that a couple of times, and there were a couple of ships that blew up. Mm-hmm. And so I don't think that there is a presumption that they work just because they've been so rigorously designed. I think that the presumption is that these are human designed systems, and so that means that they're prone to error. If the intelligent designer actually designed the human body, I wouldn't expect there to be like, at least not such a great possibility of error as we find in the human body. And I feel like I maybe have talked longer than you at this point, so okay. I think that we can move into more of a free flow discussion. Okay. Since I've been talking, I'll let you sort of query me on what I've said so far, I guess.
Okay. Yes, because you covered a lot of ground. So, so let's see how we can kind of start diving into this. So you are correct that we do have natural explanations for a lot of things in nature. Kind of redundant, but yes, we do see the water cycle. We understand how that works. We do see, how photosynthesis works. We understand that there are natural explanations to things, and you're correct that there was a time when people did not understand those, and so they were inserting some sort of God on top of it. Now, I would say that most of those gods they were using were false gods, that they weren't necessarily putting in, what I believe to be the one true God. but that's a different discussion. That is getting into religion, instead of truly looking at a scientific explanation to the world that we see. And I do think going to the concept of intelligent design, that is, to me, following the evidence and not inserting a religious position on this. So my question, though, is yes, and we'll deal specifically with the water cycle because that's kind of what you pulled in. We see how that cycles through, but the question is, where did that cycle come from to begin with? Why is there water? How did water actually come to be? Not that it can cycle and change form, but what actually brought those molecules together and actually put the molecules here in order for water to exist. So to me, it kind of gets into that idea of, I don't know if you're familiar with the 5 arguments for the existence of God by St. Thomas Aquinas, but Aquinas put in this concept of the argument from motion, that everything in this universe is in motion. And so something had to actually put it into motion. And it couldn't have been something here in this universe because everything is already moving. So from the movement of the planets to the movements of your cells, to the movements of atoms, to subatomic particles, everything is already in motion. And so he was really observing, everything here in this system is moving. Something outside the system had to kind of put it into motion. And so I see that kind of application to the water cycle discussion because, yes, those things are changing form. But the question is, where did that entity come from to begin with?
Okay, so the first thing that I've got written down is about where water came from. So basically, how molecules form is that you get the elements, in the environment, and then because of the electron positions in hydrogen, and then the electron positions in oxygen, those create these bonds
Right.
in there. And then how the water got here on Earth. I think one of the reigning theories right now about how water formed on the Earth was it was possibly deposited via the mini meteorites that were smashing into the early Earth. While just after the period where it was really hot and lava-y, I guess. After that point, you still had meteorites that were striking the Earth, and those probably had ice deposits on them, and it deposited the ice here on the Earth. So that's how water got here on the Earth. And now, so the formation of water molecules is all explained by the laws of chemistry and physics.
Right. And I guess, sorry, to clarify, I'm not saying I understand the chemistry behind water. The point is not, technically how do the electrons bond and form, that you have 2 hydrogen and 1 oxygen. The point is, where did the hydrogen and the oxygen come from? If the meteorite is bringing ice, that means ice was created or formed or begun somewhere else. So all you've done is you've kind of moved the starting point back a little bit to say it was then on a meteor. We could really dive into, why is chemistry stable? And I know, yes, we can generate molecules that are unstable, but the stability of how those molecules exist with the electrons, with the protons, with the neutrons, that there's different numbers of electrons in the different outer valence shells of them that can combine and form different types of bonds to generate all of the material that we see. And the stability of that, I think, is something that we need to really look into as well. If this were a randomly popped out universe, there's nothing that says the chemistry that's going to produce water, which we could not exist without. Why is that possible? Why is that stable? Why do we have the elements that we have in order for life to exist here?
Well, so as far as how did the oxygen and hydrogen get here, as far as we can tell, in the early universe, after it inflated, and actually it would have been about 300,000 years after the inflation of the universe, when atoms started to form and everything like that.
Now, that violates the laws of physics, that the atoms are the matter cannot be creating itself. Matter cannot be created or destroyed in nature.
Well, I didn't say that matter what was created or destroyed. I just said the universe inflated, and that when 300 years after it inflated, and atoms began to form out of the stuff, if you will, that filled the universe. It was actually hydrogen, helium, and lithium that were the first elements that popped up, and then as stars began to form, which again is 300,000 years at least after the universe inflated, then stars would have started to create heavier elements, and so these stars just they smash atoms together. If they fuse things, that's how you get light from like our sun. It's nuclear fusion that's happening, and that fills the universe. Every time a star explodes, it fills the universe with all these heavier elements. And so as these elements interact with the environments that they find themselves in, they eventually form all the different elements that we do find. Now, as far as the inflation of the universe, that actually has to go to quantum mechanics, which I don't know if you really want to get into that, but there's like this absolute nothing that a lot of people think about when we're talking about the beginning of the universe doesn't actually exist, because the nothing that exists that we can at least observe still has at least a small amount of energy within it. So because it does have this small amount of energy within it, that means that we can definitely get a universe out of nothing. And it's due to how quantum scalar fields work whenever they're in a false vacuum state and they bump over into a true vacuum state. We've observed them to release an immense amount of energy.
Right. And and that's the thing, when you're starting with that dense amount of energy, that's still something. And
right.
So what that is getting into is trying to argue that the universe is eternal then.
No, not that the universe is eternal, but maybe that just reality in general is. See, I actually don't think that as far as creationism goes, with the creationist view, I don't think that you can separate God from reality, because reality meets all the criteria that somebody would attribute to a God as far as like creationism goes, unless you're arguing for a specific version of God.
Well, I would think most, I guess I can't infer everyone's definition of God, but if we define God just in this idea of something outside of this universe, so if we define the universe as time, space, energy, and matter, then really what we're talking about, at least for my purposes, is that this intelligent designer, whatever you want to call it, because I'm not trying to define which God it is for this purposes of this discussion. So whatever you want to call it is existing outside of time, space, energy, and matter. And so there's this entity, this intelligent designer that is eternal, and we can talk about that, why that has to be so if you want. But then there has to be some instantiation where the energy and the time and the space and the matter begin. And so if you're saying it all comes back to this dense packet of energy, it still is begging the question of where did that dense packet of energy come from? And so I hear what you're saying, that, of whatever heavy elements and things were exploding off of stars and all of that, but we still have to somehow explain where did those heavy elements come from, because that's still something. So saying there's a lithium atom somewhere is still something that has to come from somewhere, right? It has to begin to exist, unless you're saying that the universe is eternal.
No, I haven't said that the universe is eternal. I've only said that reality is eternal, and I'm differentiating between reality and this universe, because this universe obviously inflated, at least this instantiation of this universe, but we also can't rule out like multiple universes existing. That's why I said like the fabric of reality is what we're talking about. And to go back to the quantum mechanics thing, I generally lean with the scientific consensus, or not consensus, but the scientific theory about a quantum scalar field called the inflaton field, and that's just what they've named it. And basically, it was in a false vacuum state at one point, and then it fluctuated from a false vacuum state into a true vacuum state for whatever reason. It didn't even necessarily have to have a cause that forced it to do that. It just did that because that's how quantum mechanics works. But when it fluctuates from this false vacuum state into a true vacuum state, it releases a huge amount of energy. And that huge amount of energy inflated the universe near instantaneously, and which it still continues to inflate today. But at the inflation point, it inflated it near instantaneously and filled the universe with the energy needed, and this energy then transformed from one state to another state that would eventually become the matter that we have today. But of course, that didn't happen until 300,000 years after the inflation point, because of the fact that it was so hot and dense in the universe that not even atoms could form. And so once atoms did start forming, the simplest atoms that formed were hydrogen, helium, and lithium. Those were the simplest ones that formed at first. So, I mean, I never said that this universe was eternal. I just mean that reality, which is separate from this universe, extends outside of our universe. So that's all that I was saying with that.
Okay. So that means, though, even if you have the multiverse theory or the inflation theory, you're still inserting something to spawn off atoms, to spawn off energy. Those are still substances that still require some explanation as to where they came from.
But I feel like I'm sorry. I know I'm interrupting. Okay. I feel like I kind of explained that, though, with the quantum mechanics explanation.
Right. Okay. So, well, that's true. I mean, you're giving a theory about it, but everywhere, if you go back and think about all of the words that you used with your theory, you're still saying it expanded, the universe expanded. Well, what is the universe? That's still going to be something, either material or energy, either matter or energy. So there has to still be somewhere something is doing these things, and you even said then it would create these different atoms because those are the simplest, right? Because they only have, one electron, so in its outer shell. So those are still things. That's still material. So I think somewhere we need to go back and figure out, well, what actually began those things. But instead of belaboring all of that, because I feel like we're kind of at that impasse of discussing that type of thing, I did want to go back and talk about. Because you had mentioned the systems engineering about the vehicle and how that doesn't exactly apply to the body. And you're right, there are simpler existences that don't require all the same circulatory, respiratory, nervous systems that we have. I think the main point, though, is that we do require all those systems. And the natural explanation would have to be that we are slowly, incrementally building up from something simple. Right. I mean, that would be the natural explanation, that we would start with something simple and we'd add a component or a device or a feature or whatever. And then that becomes the main genetic makeup for the population. And then they acquire, again, something on top of that to make it a little bit more complex and a little bit more complex. I think really the takeaway point is that, yes, there are different levels of complexity of things in this world, but that those that are complex, we need all of those things at one time. You can't look at the human body and say that it would have been a simpler incremental way to build up to what we do have to have, because there's not this merging gradual transition between types. And so you'd mentioned the fossil record. So are you familiar with the Cambrian explosion?
Yeah, I am.
Okay. So when we look at the Cambrian explosion, so it's called an explosion because it's a very, very small amount of time when you're talking about millions of years ago. It was only over, it's been a while since I've looked at it, I think maybe 10 million years, which is very small when you're talking about the billions of years, for how long the evolutionary picture was going to take. But in that, there's an explosion, basically, of 26 different phyla of body plans that are unique and distinct, and very complex, even for a simple organism. They still require multiple systems working together. And they're very distinct. 26 different phyla appear all at the same time without any evolutionary type of history, because that is the oldest level that we really look at. So the Precambrian era has sponge cells in it. And then all of a sudden you come up to the Cambrian and you have this really fast explosion of very different body types all appearing at the same time. And that's kind of the same thing when you talked about the eye, that all of these different organisms have different eye types, but yet they are all appearing at the same time. And it's interesting you talk about the eye, because I just recently wrote an article about that yes, there's different types of eyes around, but there's not this slow incremental buildup from one eye type to the next, because they all are requiring different types of components. So I kind of walked through the example, and now I don't want to read, but I'll kind of pull up something that I had talked about recently. If we look at the difference between the pigment cup eye, which is found in a planaria, which is like a teeny tiny, it just looks like a little worm, but it just has a light sensitive spot. And then if you look at the pinhole eye of a nautilus, which is still considered a very simple eye, they have totally different structures to them, to where it's not you just take the pigment cup eye, the light sensitive spot, and add a few things and you end up with a pinhole eye. They still have very different purposes, different functions, different components. And though in the planaria, you have this cup of dark pigment that only has a few photoreceptors, and there's not really a full optical system. There's only just a little opening that allows a little bit of light into the cup, and the eye is extremely small. It's only like 0.004 inches. And so it has to restrict how much light is coming in so that it only reaches one photoreceptor, because there's not very many. And so this is not going to be an eye that's useful for hunting prey or for getting away from predators or anything other than just what a planaria does, which is kind of just floats around in a petri dish, basically. But then if you look at the pinhole eye that's found on the nautilus, its eye is, orders of magnitude bigger, even though it's still small. It's 0.4 inches, but that's orders of magnitude bigger than the planaria eye. And it has millions of photoreceptors. It now has muscles that's going to move it around. It has pupils that can vary in diameter based on how much light intensity is coming through. It still doesn't have a lens, but it has a wider angle of view for each one of those photoreceptors. And so there's a very big difference just between these two very simple eye types. And if you were to start adding all those components to the planaria eye in order to make it a nautilus eye, you basically have a very ill-adapted, poorly adapted planaria. I mean, because it can't do anything with the pinhole eye. So otherwise, you have to start changing all other types of things about the body of the planaria in order to get to the nautilus. And now we have lots of systems that have to change at one time in order to get to the nautilus, because changing them incrementally one at a time, you don't get a functional planaria. And I think that's kind of applying that same kind of logic to what I was talking about with the human body organ systems, is that you can't have the slow buildup from something simple, because you need all of those things at one time to work, which was, the analogy of the rocket, the launch vehicle, because you can't just slowly add, this bottle for the main propulsion system and not also add the avionics and not also add the structure. You're going to have to build it all up together, because it requires all those things working together. So
sorry,
that was a lot. I'm sorry.
I've got it. No, that's fine. I've got a bad habit of interrupting people, so I'm trying hard not to interrupt or anything.
Okay.
Just curious, is the planaria an ancestor of a nautilus?
Well, I honestly don't know where they would put that on the evolutionary chain, but their eye type is always considered ancestral, because it's just a light sensitive spot, and then you have the pinhole eye. So if you're talking about the transition of eye types, right? Those are two organisms that have that eye type.
Well, so, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I understand. I guess I was just kind of hearkening back to how you could change the planaria eye to be like the nautilus eye, but it wouldn't it wouldn't have any benefit. It would be it would be different. You'd have to change things about the planaria in order for it to be beneficial to it. And so I gotta wonder, because here's how my understanding of evolution, and I'm wondering if it matches your understanding of evolution.
Okay.
Because as far as I understand with evolution, gradual changes occur in a population of organisms over time. The adaptations or the changes that allow the organisms to propagate and survive end up winning out and becoming, part of that population of organisms. And so over long periods of time, you end up seeing transitions from simple organisms like the planaria to something a bit more complex. And so I guess if you were to evolve a planaria as far as you would as far as you would for a nautilus, depending on the environment and everything like that, you still wouldn't get a nautilus. You would get something totally different. Right. So, my point is that just because there are different eye types, the way an organism evolves means that the environment that it's in shapes the form that it takes. And the attributes and changes that eventually come about in this population are a result of its ability to promote survival of that species. So while the eye has independently evolved in different groups of animals, it still it's all about the survival of the species.
Well, so I think that's the question, though. How did the eye independently evolve without also changing the organism? And I think that's kind of my point, that the planaria, it can't independently evolve this eye without changing everything else about it. It's not going to function anymore if its eye is suddenly, 100 times bigger than the planaria is itself.
well, but I guess I feel like you're not considering the fact that as the organism evolves, it's not like the eye's isolated, right? That the
Right.
eye isn't going to be the only thing that changes. If this planaria organism,
right? I think we're agreeing.
Right.
It can't be the only organism or the only organ that changes.
Okay.
Right. Okay,
So,
I'm sorry.
Well, I mean, so my point is that if you evolve a planaria organism, it's never going to turn out to be a nautilus. It may or may not turn out to have a pinhole eye. But my point is that it would be governed by the environment that it's in as to what attributes allow it to survive. So if it is in this environment for however many millions of years, and it changes over that amount of time, the only changes that are really going to stick around and allow that population to survive are going to be ones that promote survival. So it's not just going to be like a planaria with a single eye on its head or something like that. The rest of the organism would change as well.
Right. Okay. So I think we're really agreeing on this. Okay.
Okay.
That the planaria cannot just change its eye; it has to change its whole, the rest of its body. And so no, we're not. It doesn't it's not necessarily going to turn into the nautilus. Okay. That was just kind of the example. If evolution is saying the light sensitive spot, that pigment cup eye, becomes a pinhole eye, those are just two example organisms with those two different types of eyes, that you can see the different function, the different purpose, the different environment that those eyes exist in. The problem, though, is if you're going to change the pinhole or the pigment cup eye into the pinhole eye, you have to change a lot more than just the eye. You have to change the rest of the body too to accommodate this new eye type, the muscles for it, the pupil for it, the millions of new photoreceptors that have to go into it to become a pinhole eye. And I think now that's going to be a problem with evolution because you need multiple changes to happen at the same time. Whereas evolution says each change has to be incremental and slow and gradual and really micro mutations, or it is going to kill the organism. And that's really what they've seen in laboratory experiments. That when they make, sorry, go ahead. Yeah, I can see you're questioning that.
Well, yeah. Well, I don't understand what you mean by micro mutations, and then how micro mutations would cause an organism to, die or something.
Okay. So what they've done in genetics experiments, they've used the fruit fly, Drosophila, because it replicates so quickly. It has such a short lifespan, and they have gone in and done a number of genetic mutations, all the possible genetic mutations that they can do. And they found that 70% of them kill the organism, like they're detrimental to it, the mutations are. 30% of them are weakly beneficial, or they're neutral, meaning it might change the color of it, but that's not going to progress it to anything in the evolutionary chain, so to speak. And they're making these mutations. They have to be micro mutations, because if you have a macro mutation, it actually ends up killing the organism. It just dismantles it, usually in the embryonic development type stage. If there's such a large genetic mutation, then it kills the organism. Okay, so they have to be micro mutations, and that's even. All right, so I see you're questioning that. Did you have a question for?
Well, because I guess I'm having trouble understanding what the difference between a micro mutation and a bigger mutation is.
Okay. So between the two terms, micromutation would be in the genetics within the species, right? Macromutation is going to be that change takes it out of that kind of organism into a different kind of organism that would be what would be necessary for the evolutionary chain to exist.
Well,
You're going to change the organism type.
Well, okay, so but you understand that that's not what evolution says. Evolution doesn't say that one organism will birth a completely different organism.
Correct. Yes, I'm agreeing with that.
Okay.
Right. So we're agreeing. All of the changes have to be that micromutation. You can't have a large scale change, because that's not what evolution says, right?
Right. Yeah.
Okay. So we're talking like teeny tiny incremental genetic mutations that slowly alter the organism, so that over time, billions of those build up to then a macro level change.
Right.
Right. Okay. So I think what the problem is when you're looking at the planaria, what you've said is that for it to develop, and we're still kind of talking its eye, right? The light sensitive spot on the planaria, to become a pinhole eye, it needs more changes than just the eye. It's going to have to change the size of it, its environment, it needs a different muscle structure, all of those things to support a different eye. Now we're talking lots of different changes at one time, because doing just one of them at a time is going to not be a survival advantage for that planaria. Right. So if we're talking micromutations, that we can only alter one slight thing at a time, because that's what evolution says, right? Then if we take the planaria eye that only has a few photoreceptors and we dump in millions of photoreceptors on its slow progression to the pinhole eye, it doesn't have a functional eye anymore. So it's not going to survive as the planaria. It's going to get naturally selected out of the gene pool.
Well,
right?
I mean, for those mutations that don't benefit it, I can't remember the exact statistics. I think it's somewhat similar to what you had said before. Most mutations are either neutral or detrimental, or not either neutral or detrimental. But
right.
I will agree with that. But that means that the good mutations do survive. So, I mean, so for an organism to evolve, like a population of organisms to evolve, while most mutations are going to be neutral or detrimental, that still means that those good mutations are going to allow the organism to survive. So I'm kind of curious as to like, do you have any specific citations for the idea that one micromutation is going to cause a species to be wiped out? Or is that not what you're saying?
That's not what I'm saying. But I guess what I'm saying is if we take that planaria and we make that one micromutation, it doesn't have a fully functional different type of eye. It now has it has an eye that works worse than it did before the mutation. And so
how do you know that?
Well, I'm speaking hypothetically, because I really want to see hypothetically, how would this evolutionary through micromutations actually progress to a different organism? If you can only make one slight change at a time, and they have to be random, how is it going to continue to give an advantage to that particular organism that it's going to propagate through the rest of that population and that generation, that it's actually going to be that survival advantage? So,
well, because the mutations happen, right? And the mutations that would cause an organism to not survive, that are not beneficial, what would not survive, past that organism, or maybe one or two organisms after that. The point is that eventually those traits die off, right? The neutral mutations, they stay in the organism, and then the good mutations would allow the organisms to survive. So you got this population, and you've got some of them dying off due to these bad mutations, but then you've got this contingent that is surviving better and is passing along those genes to their descendants. And with the fact that the neutral genes and the good genes working together in the environment, but because the environment's very important here as to whether or not the mutation's beneficial. Because a mutation in one environment could be beneficial, but in another environment could not be beneficial.
Right.
So I guess my point is that what we're seeing is, at least like right now, as far as the world that we see now, what we're seeing is the end product of that line of mutations that has resulted in the forms of life that we have now. So we're not talking about the bad mutations that happened where those particular organisms died off, but we're talking about the line of organisms where the neutral and good mutations have survived in the species, and we're here now at this point in time.
Right. So I think the problem is that we can't. The hypothetical recreation of what changes would take place to incrementally go from one organism type to another. Okay, so let's use a different example. Let's say to go from, because I know on the evolutionary tree, we go from fish to amphibians to reptiles. So we're going to go from a frog to an alligator. And no, I don't mean a frog gives birth to an alligator. I'm not saying that. But let's just look at their particular egg type. Okay? Because for evolution to work, the reproductive system still has to work. Okay? So you can't have a genetic micromutation that destroys its ability to reproduce, because then you don't have the next generation of organisms to try to evolve, right? So if we're going to progress incrementally, gradually, transitioning between a frog egg type to a alligator egg type, we have to have some intermediate egg type that bridges the gap between that. And if we agree that the evolutionary progression has to be micromutations, one tiny step at a time, my question is, what change could you do first? Of the few change, I say few, if we're going to talk like a simplified explanation here, to go from a frog egg to a reptile egg, could you do first and not destroy the frog egg? Okay.
Well, so I mean, I'm not like a biologist or a zoologist, so I don't know the exact changes in these organisms, which I mean, going from amphibian to reptile, I'm not exactly I don't know if that's how the evolutionary clades work, but there would be incremental changes, you know, between
Right.
between one clade and another clade.
But it
There's
has
these
to not destroy. It has to not destroy the species in the transition. So
right,
that's, so if you just picture the frog egg, like it has to be in water. It's jelly like, right? Even without knowing all the details. But then we know and what comes out of the frog egg is a tadpole, and it has to go through metamorphosis, right?
right,
So if we look at the alligator egg, it's a hard shell. It doesn't have to be in water. And what comes out, it actually has to have, the baby actually has to have a tooth to peck out of the egg to crack to hatch.
mm-hmm.
And then what comes out is a miniature adult, right? It's an alligator, but it's just on a small scale. It doesn't go through metamorphosis. So if we just think just on those terms, just very general terms, how would we, with one micromutation at a time, change from that jelly-like frog egg that has to be in the water without a tooth to break it out, because otherwise it would destroy the egg, and an organism that has to go through metamorphosis to this one? One slight successive modification at a time, to me, it requires a whole scale change. But then, like you
Right.
said, that's a
Well,
macromutation that violates the premise of the slow micromutation process.
well, I feel like understanding the evolutionary tree between the two is very important here, because
Okay.
have you heard of the law of monophily?
That sounds familiar, but I could not tell you what that was. So go ahead, tell me.
Okay, so the law of monophily says that an organism that's part of one clade will always, and a clade is like a group of organisms that express a certain set of traits, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like you've got a clade of organisms, and that organism will that organism's descendants will always be in that clade, right? So like the frogs will always be in the clade of organisms of that express the characteristics of having lungs and four limbs, right? Like
Okay.
I don't know. I again, I'm not I'm not like a zoologist or a biologist or to know what the different clade names are, but so basically frogs will always be in that clade, and alligators will always be in that clade.
Mm-hmm.
But frogs are actually split. Like that's let's see, 1, 2, 3. That's 4 clades back. On with the differences between frogs and alligators. Okay. So what I'm trying to say here is that a frog will never become an alligator.
Okay.
So and what you have is as far as the different clades that we've been able to establish, you've got the lungs with 4 limbs clade, and then what you have is claws or nails developing. Those are in a group, and then you'll have keratinous scales, the scales that they have, and then you've got the quote unquote gizzard. And then on one branch you've got feathers that develop, and then on another branch you have alligators. So alligators are actually more closely related to birds than they are frogs.
Well, but that's the thing. You have to transition between each of those, right? Even if they're 4 clades apart, there has to be some sort of transition that goes between that. So how is it getting from a gelatinous egg to the hard-shelled egg? How is it bridging the gap in the reproductive system? What organism has a hybrid of that?
Well, I'm not going to be able to explain that to you. But what I can tell you is that through the 4 different clades and the millions of generations that had these mutations working on them, you eventually end up with all of the good and neutral mutations resulting in alligators and birds.
Okay. Well, I guess what I'm trying to say is that we can't even hypothetically determine what change would come first to have micromutation level changes between these organism types and not destroy the organism. And I know what you're saying, that, of course, only the ones that help the organism survive, right, that are beneficial mutations, are going to be carried forward. And I guess my point is that, yes, there are micromutations within a species, within a kind of organism. But the amount of change that's necessary to jump out of that kind of organism to a different kind of organism requires more whole-scale changes than what evolution would allow, that it's not a natural, slow, incremental process, because it requires multiple changes at one time, which to me goes to creation, right?
Well,
especially when we couple that with that Cambrian explosion, when we have 26 different body types showing up in the fossil record all at the same time, and they're distinct from one another. They're not slowly, gradually transitioning into one another.
Well, so, I mean, as far as the Cambrian explosion goes, that's a 20 million year period. And so you're talking about 20 million years of changes and everything that happen.
But if it is, okay, so if you're saying that that's 20 million years that things can evolve between each other, that's ridiculously fast for evolution to work. When you're talking about 70% of mutations are detrimental, and how many tiny micromutations you would need to transition between each of these types, just probability and statistic wise, that's improbable for you to have that many favorable mutations in that span of time, if we're having trouble finding them in the billions of years span of time.
No, I don't. No, it doesn't really make sense to me, because I don't see that being a problem for evolution, given that mutations happen, and these mutations don't, like, you don't have to have like a huge or a huge number of mutations to happen all at once in order for an organism to change.
Well, you would, if you're going to explain all of those arriving within the Cambrian explosion as being evolution, then you would have to have a bunch of them happening super quickly for that to happen in 20 million years.
Well, super quickly being millions of years. I mean, we're talking about geologic timescales here. So, I mean, it takes a long time for these things to happen.
Right.
So I mean,
so if all of those things are showing up in a span that's only 20 million years, that's too much change to happen in that short amount of time. And I know short is relative, but short based on compared to the whole geologic column, that's a short amount of time. That's why they call it an explosion.
This relates to the Cambrian explosion, but do you know that crustaceans have evolved independently like 5 times on Earth? Like there are 5 I think it's 5. There's multiple different lines of crustaceans that have evolved independently of one another. Okay. And so my point in bringing this up with the Cambrian explosion is that you don't have to have like in the Cambrian explosion, you got one population of organisms, and then, you have to explain all the different body types, with all that. You've got several different populations that are convergently evolving, these same traits. Another good example of convergent evolution is with pandas, red pandas, and another the black and white pandas. I think they're just pandas. Anyways, those two they independently developed their fake thumb, and in order to be able to eat the bamboos that that's in their environment that they live off of. And so they independently evolved those things because it allowed them to survive. It was beneficial to them in the environment that they were in. So I don't think that you necessarily need one single like sequential line of evolution to explain all the body types. I think that you could have multiple simultaneously evolving populations of organisms that produced all the different body types. So there's that.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I didn't know how much longer you wanted to go, because we have been going for about an hour or 45, and I don't want to we've been going a little bit over an hour, about an hour and 15 minutes. So I don't know how long we didn't talk about that
I know.
beforehand.
I meant to ask you too before we got on how long, because we could go forever, I think.
Yeah, we could. Well, I think, would you be okay going for the next 15 minutes to
Sure.
round out the hour and a half?
Sure. I'm fine with that.
Okay. All right.
So yeah, well, I guess to your point, the crustaceans, 5 different, those are still crustaceans though. When we're talking about the different body plans, we're talking about different phyla at the phyla level. Okay. So it sounds like with the 5 different types of crustaceans, that would all be within one phyla. But that's what shows up on, in the Cambrian explosion, that there's these vastly different types of body plans. And so, yes, even if you had some evolution between the two, 20 million years, that's lightning fast. When you talk about the typical definition or explanation of evolution changing and explaining all the variety. And no, I don't mean that every single type of species appeared in the Cambrian explosion, but those distinct body plans show up at the same time. So I don't know if.
Well, I was just going to ask, because it's been brought up a couple of times. Could you define what you mean by kinds?
Well, so kingdom, phylum, order, class, family, genus, species, right? Their classification of organisms. So I'm talking more like at the family level. So right above genus. So because there is variation within species. But what evolution needs is to break out of that actual body plan type of organism into something totally different. So, for example, like if we're going to go from an ant to a wasp, they actually have a drastically different body plan of how many different segments they have. One has 3 segments, one has 2 segments. And so those have to have there's actually an issue of when a genetic mutation could take place in order to change the body plan of the ant and the wasp. Okay. Or even if you put the spider in there that has 1 segment. So they're similar organisms, but they have different body plans. And so if there's a mutation that's going to change the body plan to go from a 2 segment to a 3 segment, if that happens really early in the embryonic development, it kills the organism. It can no longer actually grow in the embryonic stage because that mutation has damaged everything else about it. But if a mutation happens later in the embryonic process, that body plan to be 2 segment or 3 segment has already been set. And so there's not a valid mutation that can take place that would actually change it from a 2 segment organism to a 3 segment organism. Because if it happens early in the process, it kills it. If it happens late in the process, that body plan's already set through the embryonic development. And so those are the types of mutations that evolution has to have to then change it to that different clade that you're talking about that has a drastically different feature about it to then actually progress to a new organism type.
Well, so yeah, but I mean, I still have to harken back to the whole law of monophily thing because, like, ants, the insects that we know of ants now will never be wasps.
Right.
They could, I guess, potentially become wasp-like in the future,
right?
But they're never going to be wasps. Right. So I guess I don't understand.
But you need something to go between. If you're going to explain the wasp's existence and you're going to say it got there through evolution, something has to go from some non-wasp through lots of changes to become a wasp, right?
Right.
Okay, so that's what I'm saying. If even if you're just talking about changing the from a 2 segmented body to a 3 segmented body, you have to change that body segment type to get from one to the other. I'm not saying an ant produced a wasp, but you have to have some slight modification, some tiny change to go between them. And I'm saying even those tiny changes aren't going to be able to adequately break it out of its kind to start the path to a new kind.
Well, so what we know about like the evolution of both ants and wasps, just to stay in this particular example.
Okay.
There was a totally different organism that was totally different from both wasps and ants. That it divided, and one particular path evolved into ants, and one particular path evolved into wasps. So, like, I'm not going to sit here and speculate what that organism was, what its biomechanical processes were, or anything like that. But I get the feeling that you're possibly speculating about that organism, and then speculating further to say, well, if this one particular type of mutation, which I don't honestly, I don't even know like if that level of mutation is what would happen. Like the mutations are so granular, and there's multiple mutations that happen at one time. I sincerely doubt the whole one mutation happens and the embryo of this organism dies immediately, like and will never be born. Which I feel is like the argument that you're making.
Well, for that particular type of mutation, to change the body plan. I mean, there could be other mutations that would change its color, but that's the thing for evolution to start progressing. Though it has to have mutations that give a totally different. It can't just be a variety within the species. It has to break it out of the actual body plan for that organism. So if you're saying the common ancestor, that there was some ancestral parentage that then gave rise to both the ant and the wasp, then that ancestral parent has to have had some sort of body plan that could possibly have a 3-segment and a 2-segment. But we have to think about on the genetic level of how would that actually work. I think that's the struggle, is when we actually kind of put the pencil to the paper of what would actually change and not kill the organism, that is a big enough change that it actually starts breaking it out of just a variety of wasp to become an ant. It starts to become kind of a statistical nightmare of what is actually going to happen to drive that level of change, if we're talking just micromutations.
Well, so I'm not a geneticist,
right.
and so while I'm not a geneticist, I do understand how mutations do change things in animals, and I don't like this whole concept of big changes. I feel like you're talking about mutations on a quote unquote micro level, but then you're trying to represent them as like these bigger changes. And like I don't think that I nor you can speculate about the common ancestor as to whether or not this particular mutation could occur and it would produce viable offspring. I mean, obviously there was a set of mutations that occurred that allowed for that split in the common ancestor between ants and wasps.
Obvious? Well, why do you say obviously? Why do you say
because
obviously?
There's a clear evolutionary line between that connect both wasps and ants to a common ancestor a few generations back.
But based on what?
Based on that's what I was trying to get at with the whole what was your definition of kind, because it seems like morphology is what you're looking at there. But I mean, that's how we do classify animals, is by what morphology do they have. If we if there's a slow gradual change from one morphology to another morphology, then that results in a change of kind, if you will. If you're looking at it from that point of view,
right? But I just think that the obviously it happened. I don't think that's obvious, because I don't think that there's a clear way, even hypothetically, because it's not in the fossil record. We don't have any fossil record of this type of transition. So the fossil record shows distinct body plans showing up in a very short relative amount of time. But even the hypothetical transition between these species, that's what I'm trying to drive at, is that let's just think in the hypothetical realm. How would things have changed using, because you said slow, gradual, slight modification process that would result in a big change. And so that's what I'm saying, the big change, because eventually you have to change from organism A to organism B, and you have all these intermediate parts in between. And what I'm saying is let's even just, can we just play the guessing game of what would have been the first intermediate between A and B, and what micro change would have to happen to get between organism A to organism B. And as we've looked at these several examples of the eye and the planaria, and we talked about the frog to the reptile egg type, and the ant to the wasp, to me, it starts to fall apart, because we can't look at what first slight change could you do to that organism A, whatever example we use, right, to slowly transition it to organism B, because it has to still be not only surviving, but thriving, because it has to then, be the predominant genetic code that's going to repopulate it, but it has to reproduce. So you have to have enough of those genetic mutations in the same generation, the same population, to reproduce for that to carry forward. Because you couldn't have just, 2% of that population have a mutation. It then has to propagate across the whole population for it to then, really continue forward and change what that population looks like. So then it just becomes this probability issue of there's still not enough time for that to happen.
I don't think that there's a probability issue, because if you consider the the amount of organisms that have been in existence, which is, I'm not going to try to speculate a number, but we're talking a lot of organisms, because we're talking about millions and millions of years, which I don't know if you're old Earth or young Earth.
Oh, that doesn't matter for this discussion.
Okay. But we're talking about millions and millions of years of, generations upon generations upon generations of these changes occurring. And so with the number of animals that at least we see today on the Earth, mm-hmm. and the amount of variance that we see, I really don't see the issue there. I don't see the issue with this probability problem that you're talking about, because given enough time and enough organisms, you're going to eventually get the evolutionary lines that we plainly see out. And as far as like fossils of like ants and stuff, now I'm not sure about any kind of fossilized ants or anything like that, but I do know that like we do have organisms encased in amber, and a good example of this would be the link between scorpions and spiders, because they're actually cousins. And it was actually recently found encased in amber, this sort of spider scorpion hybrid. And so that's kind of like because every species is in transition, but it's a transition between it's kind of like a connecting organism between spiders and scorpions. And we don't have these spider scorpions anymore today. Mm-hmm. So it kind of seems to me like just because we don't know the exact morphology or the exact genetic code of any particular organism in the past that eventually produced whatever organisms that we have today, mm-hmm. I don't think that means that it all had to come about by some intelligent designer. I feel like the math works out on the amount of mutation that we have, the populations and how they reproduce and change. Like, I just don't see like a problem in the math there, because obviously, while mutations are either neutral or detrimental, there are good mutations that do happen, and those good mutations do survive in the population, and that allows that population to further survive, propagating those good mutations to the rest of the population, and thereby changing the population. And then repeating this process over millions and millions of years, you can morphologically change a species just for instance, from whatever whatever precursor there was to ants and wasps, over millions of years and these small changes, you would eventually come to ants and wasps in different clades. But they're still both part of that, parental clade. So, I mean, I get that you are very much convinced that the smallest mutation would cause the embryo to be abandoned or to not even form or not even be born or die immediately.
Well, not all of them. That's not what I meant. I don't think that all of them would destroy the embryo, but
Okay.
that particular example of changing the body plan of the ant to the wasp does, and that's proven by some experiments that geneticists have done. No, what I'm saying is when you look at what changes have to take place to go from between different organism types, because in order for this macroevolutionary picture to exist, we have to transition between types. Like at some point, you have to break out of this type of organism into a different type. Otherwise, we just have variety within one particular type of organism. We wouldn't have the variety that we have now. And what I'm trying to say is that when you look at the changes that are necessary, you can only do a micro mutation at a time. You can't do a whole scale change of the organism because that's not what evolutionary said or Darwinian evolution says. So when we look at these tiny changes where 70% of them kill the organism, they're very rarely are they beneficial, but they have to be random and yet progress somehow through this progression to a different organism type, but they all have to be benefiting the organism. So I think the statistics come in that the odds are mutations are not beneficial, because when we look at mutations in humans, they are rarely, if ever, beneficial, right? The worst thing that you can hear as a mother expecting a child is that there's some sort of genetic mutation, right? That is not a beneficial thing. So typically, mutations are not adding information. They're not gaining new things to the organism. They're taking information away or distorting information for what it should be. And natural selection actually works to preserve the genetic pool like that for what actually works for the organism. So for Darwinian evolution to work, we have to have enough of these changes to progress slowly, incrementally, slight successive modification at a time to get between out of this organism type into another one. And I'm saying when you really look at the details, it starts falling apart for how those changes are actually going to take place. Instead of just saying it evolved with this big word and glossing over the details, when we look at those tiny details of how would a pigment cup eye actually change to a pinhole eye, and what actually has to take place, and how would that be beneficial of this transition between those two eye types? How would that benefit the organism? And then how would we have enough of that same genetic mutation generating the same physical expression across the gene pool for that generation of organisms to actually then become the new population, to then have the next mutation to go to the next generation? It becomes, to me, when you look at the details, very problematic. And so I think that on top of that Cambrian explosion, on top of our systems engineering design of our body, the information that's contained in that DNA, because information has to have an intelligent source. To me, all of that speaks that there was a unique creator that created the life that we see today.
Well, so, I mean, I'm wondering, if I understand you correctly, do you think that all mutations are bad?
A vast majority of them are, yes.
Well, so, a vast, the vast majority
of them are. Yes.
Well, no, a majority are. There are obviously more bad mutations than good mutations, but the majority of mutations are either neutral or they're bad.
Right. So that means it's even less that's actually beneficial that's changing the organism.
No. I mean, it's the same amount that's been beneficial to the organism. But the fact is that not all mutations are bad for the organism. There are obviously good mutations that happen, and also, the mutations that happen are whether or not they're beneficial are entirely dependent upon the environment that they live in. But in any case, I know that I've kept you here for well over an hour and a half, and I appreciate your time. But do you want to? I know you kind of gave your final. I guess it kind of seemed like you were kind of giving your final thoughts. Was there anything else?
Yeah, I guess that was kind of, I thought, kind of wrapping it up, that really even outside of the discussion about evolution, which I love having that discussion. So I appreciate you bantering back and forth with that, because I really enjoy getting into those details. But it really comes down to, if we're talking about evolving DNA, DNA has information, and information has to come from an intelligent source. So I think, however that information evolved or mutated or didn't or whatever, it all comes back to that there has to be some intelligence that puts information in a code. And so that, to me, is, one of the biggest, the presumption of fact, that inference of the best explanation is that information is going to come from intelligence.
Well, I like I said, I appreciate you coming on here. I personally don't think that DNA can be information as it's kind of implied by what you said. I don't consider DNA to be designed at all. Like I said before, DNA shouldn't have passed any kind of like engineering review or anything like that, because of the process that it uses in order to copy the genes and produce the proteins and everything like that. I really don't see the intelligence behind it. I think that if God did design it, then he's a rather poor designer. But in any case, I don't see any problems with evolution. I should have asked you this beforehand, and you don't have to answer now, but other than, things look designed, therefore they are designed by a God or an intelligent designer. I really didn't hear any kind of real support for intelligent design. Other than just, these are things that I don't understand about biology or how these things would have evolved or anything like that. I didn't really hear, other than that, I didn't hear anything to support the intelligent design hypothesis. As far as I can tell, things have naturally evolved over time through these small mutations that do happen. Given enough time and enough organisms, with enough mutations happening, they can definitely change morphologically, and they have changed morphologically. I don't know. I don't know what the citation would be for, saying that this mutation would definitely kill off this organism. I do know that mutations can add new functionality to an organism depending on the environment that it lives in. And I feel like we're not exactly defining information here, because like I said before, DNA, I don't feel, is information depending on how you define it. We can interpret it as like information. We can interpret it as a code so that we can understand it better. But ultimately, DNA is just a chemical, and it reacts with other chemicals in line with the laws of chemistry and physics and everything like that. And there was things that we went over tonight that we didn't even get to, which I'm glad, because like there was the prime mover argument that you brought up. I had that in mind to bring up too, but we got really sidetracked on the whole evolution discussion. But I don't want to take up any more of your time, and maybe if you're up for it, maybe sometime in the future I can have you back on and we can maybe discuss some of these other things. But I want you to have your Friday night, because I know I'm going to go and spend my Friday night with my wife. And so if you will, just let everybody know where they can find you at and all that kind of stuff, and then we'll get out of here.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks for having me on. I enjoyed the discussion, and you can find me at defendthefaithministry.com. And maybe we can get back together again and continue the conversation.
That sounds great, and I'll be in contact to set that up sometime in the future. And anyways, I hope all of you heathens have a great Friday night. As you guys know, we're not going to be having our regular stream tonight, so I know some of you are really going to miss that, but we'll be back to our regular schedule next week. One thing I do need to let you guys know about is that at the end of the month, we're actually going to be having a debate that's hosted not only on this channel, but it's also going to be hosted on another channel at the same time. But we're actually going to have a debate between Richard Carrier and James Gadd over the existence of God. I kind of wanted it to be on mythicism, but I wasn't that lucky to be able to get that kind of debate, but we're going to go with whether or not God exists. So we're going to have those gentlemen on to discuss that. It'll be about a 2-hour debate. So mark your calendars, I guess, for October 30th at 6 p.m. Central Time. We'll be having a debate here on Godless Engineer. The Skeptic Mafia, we have a hangout scheduled for tomorrow afternoon. So if you guys are listening, be prepared to come on over there and hang out with me for a little bit. I do want to say that I appreciate all of the super chats that we got in tonight from the Jim Taker and Dave Lee, as well as the others that did donate. Bothell Guy, and I believe. Yeah, that's as far back as I can see too. I think there was one other one. Crap, it's not up on my little my little management studio thing. But anyways, again, Cathryn, I really appreciate you joining me tonight to talk to me about these things. And I guess we'll see you heathens later. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.